get their products. They're dumping pharmaceutical products on a market. The market is the suffering people in Africa. And in order to get money from pharmaceutical corporations, for example, they define all of the cases who come in with a certain level of sickness as AIDS, as HIV/AIDS. It doesn't matter if they have tuberculosis, malaria, or whatever. They define them as AIDS clients because it's a numbers game. The more people they prove have or say have AIDS, the more support they get from the so-called international community. And that could be through, for example, pharmaceutical products, or it could be through direct donations, or it could be through provision of vehicles through Toyota out of Japan and the so-called humanitarian sector connected to Japan. So there's all kinds of levels to break this down, but the bottom line is everything about this story is bullshit. Everything. There's a little piece of truth there and a little piece of truth here, but most of it is just absolute bullshit. Bono, the guy who did these concerts for Africa all those years, he actually came out public when George Bush went to Rwanda, I think, and he said, George Bush is the best thing that ever happened to Africa. You know, as if there's no connection to the American military, as if we're not dumping pharmaceutical products that have been tested in the United States and proven to cause all kinds of side effects in women. For example, if we're talking about birth control issues like Depo-Provera and what's that other one? Norplant. They use them in East Africa. They're distributed by foundations. They're distributed by companies. They're distributed by NGOs. They're distributed by Jane Goodall. And there's no one there to take care of the side effects. There's no one there to deal with the real issues that come up. There's a reason they don't use these products in the United States anymore. Because women in the United States learned, wealthy women, educated women, learned that they cause all kinds of side effects. Anyway, all of these hidden narratives behind this whole question of disease in Africa. And that was an example of a slide that I spent way too much time on. So, is there any more chairs? Or are you taking care of that, Russell? Everybody's got a chair, and everybody who comes will have a chair. And you have a chair. Because I can give up my stool. Okay. In London, no to dictators. Tyrant Mugabe, time to go. The theme of African dictators. Have you ever seen a picture like this of George Bush? Maybe you don't consider George Bush a dictator. What about Tony Blair? What about Omar Bashir? Who are chosen to be dictators in the world and who are chosen to be or celebrated as the heroes when there's just as much blood on their hands? So there's a politics of this kind of demonization. And the way I usually analyze this or explain it from my perspective is you've got a hierarchy. At the very bottom, you've got the poorest of the poorest of the poor people in the world. And who would they be? They would be the Twa in Rwanda, the most discriminated against minority, the indigenous people, the very, very small minority. Or the Mbuti in Congo, who were persecuted during the war, suffered their own genocide, and almost nobody paid any attention to this. That's the bottom of the pile. They're poor. It doesn't mean that they're not smart, they're not educated. It just means that in the hierarchy of exploitation, these people are the most exploited. And at the top, of course, you've got somebody like Bono, who jets around the world, or Ben Affleck, who flies into Rwanda, makes a business deal with Paul Kagame, and then goes into eastern Congo, claiming that he's going to bring this humanitarian relief to these people by founding a little NGO in eastern Congo. As if there's no connection between his business deal in Rwanda and his humanitarian relief in the Congo. Because Rwanda is the Congo's biggest problem at this point, the government of Rwanda. So when we see this, how do you analyze such a poster? Is Mugabe a tyrant? Who says? Who says he's a good guy? There's a big debate about where Mugabe falls in this range of dictators versus heroes in the African continent. He's a liberation leader who came to power in 1979, roughly 1981, by defeating the white supremacist regime of Ian Smith. But does he have any blood on his hands? And who says? And why is it my right to claim that Mugabe has any blood on his hands when I'm supporting the government that has been persecuting Zimbabwe, perhaps? You follow these different themes that I'm bringing out? The question is Mugabe a tyrant? And is he not? Is Paul Kagame a tyrant? Zimbabwe has to solve its land reform crisis. Zimbabwe is of interest because Zimbabwe participated in the war in the Congo. Whenever anybody who talks about Zimbabwe's participation in the Congo, they just dismiss it as if the people who claim that Mugabe is a great hero dismiss the participation of Zimbabwe in the Congo as if it didn't happen. Zimbabwe participated in the brutal exploitation of the Congo during the war. All kinds of bloodletting on Zimbabwe's hands. This is Mugabe and his friends, his partners in business. This is big business. Mugabe is still celebrated as this liberation hero, as if that didn't happen. The fact that he starts returning the land to the people of Zimbabwe, who have been waiting for this land since he took power in 1979, creates this discourse that in the white eyes, in the white media's eyes, Mugabe is a is a tyrant because he's giving the land back to the people. Because the worst thing for the white supremacist system is to give the land back to the people that it belongs to. And somebody taught me years ago, if you believe in private profit, then give your land back to the Native Americans. Because we started there, and that's where it's gone to. Eastern Congo, Rwanda, Uganda, all the places I'm going to talk about was about land. It's about land. It's about controlling the resources and controlling the land, getting the people out of the way in some cases. And another level, you want to service markets to them, with Coca-Cola, for example. Anyway, I always get my mind always scrambles when I look at this picture because I get stuck looking at the left image. As if the trunk show, what is the trunk show? What does that have to do with Zimbabwe? In Matabele land, I'm just going to quickly end this piece on Zimbabwe, but they did participate in the war in the Congo. Mugabe has been involved in some really nasty stuff. From 1980 to 1986, the Mugabe government perpetrated genocide against the Ndebele people in Matabele land. The system didn't care. The government in the Thatcher government, perhaps, and the Reagan government at the time, they didn't care. They loved Mugabe. He was working with the IMF. He was working with the World Bank. He was doing everything that was expected of him, just as Museveni is today, just as Paul Kagame is today. So at the time, he was a wonderful guy. Doesn't matter how many people he's killing off in the bush. Forget about those savages. That's exactly what happened. It's well documented, the genocide against the Ndebele people. But even when they talk about Mugabe as a tyrant today, very rarely or never do they bring up the subject of the genocide perpetrated against the Ndebele people in the 1980s in Zimbabwe. So there's a discourse. There's leave things out, put things in, include some information, but if tomorrow it doesn't work anymore, we'll just substitute it with some other false information. The media is very twisted. So it's black, it's unfathomable, it's savagery. There's no definition to this man. He's a black shape. It's fear. It's breeding fear in the American public. This is what this does. And I'm going to speak mostly about the American public because here we are in America, and the people in France have similar problems and similar issues, but they're not, in many ways, some of them, not quite as bad. Oh, and then always we get this image about Joseph Kony. Here's another example. Blood when Ebola came to St. Mary's. Blaine Harden is a CIA operative. So if somebody wants to do an interesting study, do a study of Blaine Harden's reportage. Where he was, what he did, what he said, when, and who's he connected to, what he reports on, what he leaves out, what he includes. White, sterile, Western civilization bringing hope and relief to Africa. Front page, cover, New York Times Magazine, Jesus on the cross, black, darkness, microbes floating around. This is think tank material. When Ebola came to St. Mary's, the story is about Uganda. It was at the height of the Congo War. Ebola came to St. Mary's in Uganda, not because of what Blaine Harden tells you, which was 8 pages full of bullshit, but because Ugandan soldiers who'd been killing in the Congo came back to Uganda carrying Ebola from some of the regions they'd been working in. Nobody said anything like that. It was very well known, very well hidden. So this is the standard propaganda. This is basically the kind of propaganda we get all over the place. Many people know about Darfur. The whole subject of genocide in Darfur has become a very contentious subject at a certain level. Smith College hosted this event because at Smith College you've got an English professor who became very prominent in the whole Sudan and Darfur movement. And he's been taking State Department information straight from the State Department, producing reports, writing articles. He's an English professor. He's a very good writer. He creates a good, well-thought-out article, but it's absolute nonsense. It's State Department, CIA information coming from a guy named Roger Winter in Sudan. And I'll mention him later. So, and by the way, that poster is very expensive flyers. Who funds these expensive events? It wasn't Smith College. This one was funded by an organization called Witnessing Darfur, or the Save Darfur movement in Western Mass, the Coalition to Save Darfur, and the STAND movement, which is Students Taking Action Against Darfur Now, all funded by the Center for American Progress, who funds an organization called Enough, who funds them. And the money coming from the Center for American Progress is hidden. So where it's actually coming from is uncertain. But this is an expensive flyer. You don't see an expensive flyer up for the Brecht Forum, and I'm not going to blame Russell or Sheila about that. So, anyway, I've talked way too much on the propaganda. So here's the oil map of Africa, and I'm just going to stand up for a second and just show you. This I picked up in Africa, in Zambia, here in the capital, in 2000. In 2000, I was floating around Zambia, and I met this petroleum engineer who said, "Hey, I got a map I want to show you." He's a Zambian guy. And he sold it to me for 30 bucks, which was enough money to feed his family for a month and a half, and he was really happy about that. And for me, I had a low budget, so I was really happy about it too, because I could never get this in America because it would cost me $1,000 or something like that. Libya has an incredible amount of oil. These are all oil concessions. Oil concessions. Madagascar, since this was a 1996 map, and since then, Madagascar has been mapped out for oil. All of these green spots that were not claimed concessions at the time, most of them have been taken over now by oil companies. Different concessions have been given or taken by different companies. For example, up here in northern Kenya, where there's a genocide going on against the Turkana people, Adolf Lundin, a famous, very wealthy Swedish guy, very close to George Herbert Walker Bush, has a company called Talisman Energy that's working the oil here. Talisman and the Lundin companies are also operating down here in Katanga, where they're in the cobalt. And they're also up here in South Sudan and North Sudan. And this is Darfur, one gigantic oil concession as of 1996. There's more to the story than just saving a bunch of Africans being killed by a bunch of savage Muslims, which is the Islamic government of Sudan, of course. So that's the oil map, and oh, it's important to notice this. Maybe about the size of Massachusetts, there's a big oil concession right in the heart of the Congo, controlled or sunk. The oil was discovered by, I believe it was Chevron back in the 1970s, but President Mobutu wouldn't let them exploit it, which is one of the reasons why they finally got rid of Mobutu. Mobutu wanted to refine it within Zaire. Mobutu, if anybody doesn't know the story, was in power from 1960, roughly 62, effectively 65, or effectively 62, roughly 65 until 1997. And under the lakes, gigantic oil concessions, said to be under the Lake Albert, there's said to be more oil in the Simliki Basin than Saudi Arabia. Now, that's the oil companies saying that, and I think it's all hype, but there's a lot of oil there. We don't see that kind of map in the media. Will Darfur be the next Rwanda? Are you going to let Darfur be the next Rwanda? Wow, I could spend an hour and a half or 2 or 3 just talking about that one sentence. All of the information and the themes and subliminal, undiscussed, unspoken force behind that statement. Will you let Darfur be the next Rwanda? There's that image of the suffering child. No background, no history, no facts. Stop genocide in Darfur, because the last thing we want is 800,000 innocent Darfur people slaughtered with machetes like they did in Rwanda. And here's Philip Gurevich in the New Yorker, which is one of the premier venues for State Department propaganda on the subject of Rwanda, for example, definitely Congo. And Philip Gurevich wrote the book, "We wish to inform you that tomorrow our families will be killed," which always makes me just about gag. Partly out of jealousy and partly out of the fact that it's just pure propaganda. The guy's a good writer, and that's how he does this. But he's also a State Department hack.